American nonprofit organizations. And she did that for a long time and has more recently been involved with teaching. She was heading up the Long Island University creative writing program for a while, and now she's teaching at Brown University. So that's the sort of background to who Erica is. I wanted to start, though, since we're together in Brooklyn, to ask you where exactly you are and how are things going in your neighborhood? How are you responding to the COVID crisis? What are you doing? How are you coping? What are you thinking about? What's going on?
What's going on? Well, it's very quiet here. I live on the Prospect Lefferts Crown Heights border near Nostrand Avenue, Empire Boulevard. I'm a few blocks away from Kings County Hospital. So many of my neighbors work at Kings County. If I do see people, there are not many people on the street. When I see them on the street, they're often in scrubs or they're in, hospital uniform. So it feels, both kind of eerie. If there's a lot of, but there's also, just occasional activity, and people are, very valiantly, really going to work at Kings County, which is about 4 blocks away. Not infrequently, there are sirens. It's not nonstop, but a couple times a day. And it took someone posting on Facebook, Purvi Shaw wrote a beautiful line about the sirens and me connecting, oh, that's what those are. It's not just, it doesn't have that kind of like, oh, there's a fire somewhere or there's some, some kind of emergency. I'm realizing it is connected to, the current health emergency. So yeah, that's part of like just looking out the window, what's out the window. I've gone out very little, personally, because there's, I got bronchitis like March 1. So I stayed in for 10 days. And then by that time it was kind of clear, wasn't a good idea to go out at all. So I just started staying home. So I'm like 28 days into isolation. It's, it's brought out this interesting response in me. I'm sort of, I'm given to being, I make a joke. Some people are high information and some people are low information. I'm high information, so I'm like a little hyper vigilant. I pay attention to the press conferences. Some people don't want to hear anything until the end of the day. And what we've all learned is to be tolerant of all the different styles of people who who want to minimize their knowledge, and some people like me who's always, as I call it, monitoring the perimeter. What is going on out there? So, so I do that, but I also do yoga. I do some self-care, even if it's the old people's yoga tape, where I can easily raise my hands above. I said, look at that. I can raise my hands too above my head. Oh, yes, and drop down. Oh, see, I'm doing it. The kind of yoga tape where you're immediately successful because good grief, So just remembering bodied from time to time is a good thing to do and to not just be in this tension moment. As part of my hypervigilance, I also do a lot of meal prep. Even when I had the bronchitis, I would make a big pot of soup and then I'd eat it all myself. What? So I make a big pot of chicken soup and I take a lot of care in preparing it. And that is also a way, I think, of coping. Everybody has their coping styles. And for me, soup and bean preparation has taken an inordinate amount of time. So those things. And I'm online and I'm doing the teaching online. So that's also challenging, I think, to figure out how to make something engaging on a screen. And so I spend a fair amount of time thinking about that, so I do a lot of gesturing, as you really, I'm gesturing into my little box as a way to draw people in to a conversation and feel like they are addressed. So that's how I'm passing time. But I'm, I've also, because I'm a writer and a poet, and a poet who pays attention to words, I'm really thinking about certain words that I've heard and how they do or don't kind of relate or somehow provide some kind of lens into the present moment, you know? I collected those words to talk about today. So I wanted to just, that sheet of paper that says global pause.
We're going to put that list up, but start to talk about it while they put it on the screen. Yeah, there it is.
Could you go to the top? So these are just some words that I'm sort of jotting down and thinking about. I happened to, even before this pandemic, I had been thinking a lot about the end of the world as a concept and how many times the end of the world has happened. We both, you know, project the end of the world as apocalyptic, but we also, for certain groups of people, the world did end, you know, in a way, but of course the end of the world is never the end of the world. It's always the shift to something else. I think about the Middle Passage for Africans. I think about indigenous people in the Americas. I think about Jews during the end of the world is really the cataclysmic, and it's this kind of, you know, place where we are blown and thrown into history. And to think about that, not, you know, and then I started thinking about, well, what parts of the world do we want to have end, right? So I always think about, I'd like to see, you know, some things end, like white supremacy, patriarchy. Maybe it's not so bad, the end to the world. Maybe the end of the world can be reimagined in some way that isn't like the apocalypse, but actually the shift. So thinking about global pause, that word global pause is something that's come to me. And I won't do all of these words, but some of these words I'm thinking of using as a prompt for some of my students. Could you write a short essay on "for the time being"? What is that? Or a short essay on "we cannot just save ourselves," right? Which is certainly true of this COVID pandemic. We can't just save ourselves. It's impossible, because if my condition, my health now relies on the health that other people do certain things. We all have to do this together. The quote, "Fierce wretchedness does glory bring us," that's from Timon. I recently saw the production of Timon of Athens by Shakespeare's play. And then finally, my last thing is that I just want to talk about how we are people, not customers of the apocalypse. Now, why this even occurs to me, Charles, is that yesterday's press conference, Trump had all these, you know, CEOs talking to the American people and reassuring us how they were taking care of us and so forth. The CEO said, "We care about our customers." And I thought to myself, oh no, we've become customers of the country, not people living in the country. And I realized that all of these were us to pay attention to them. So, okay, I'll stop here.
But I love the scrawl that was going over your document. I don't know why, but it was like this kind of human intervention in the script. Well, thank you so much for that. And I really wanted to hear, you know, how you were thinking of that. I think that we have not had great commentary, a lot of high information, but not so much high thinking and low thinking and middle thinking about what's going on, and not accepting the words that are given to us as anything more than propaganda when they come from certainly from the federal government, the Republican Party, but also from a lot of the media as well, which just accept whatever terms are thrown out as if that's the given. So much of what you've done has wanted to question what those terms are, terms like the local, for example, and perhaps paradise too. Would you read for us a poem? I mean, some people here will know your work. I think
Yep.
it's the world we live in where the voices intruding, whether they seem to be saying something benign or something sinister, are primarily what we're hearing. Voices invading us and trying to take over, how we think. So we need people like Erica Hunt and other poets and essayists and artists to offer something else. You have a new poem. Would you read it for us? What Paradise? It's not, well, I should add, it's from, and maybe we could put this up for a second, Veronica, Erica's most recent. It says now Jeremy Zier is the host. So somehow you've gotten the host being taken over by someone named Jeremy Zier. You can hear me, Erica, right?
Yep.
Well, why don't you read the poem and we'll put up the cover after that. Yeah.
Okay. What Paradise? A poem in an alternative reality. We tent ourselves in bittersweet, the more to eyebrow you, dear, for we know we are cherished for a positive outlook, hint of candor. If the correct tests are met and the results hidden, well, let them entrap me with fastidious curtain calls. Expect me to spectacle wrapped in the film version in which they have given themselves high marks. Their gems are in their pockets and they are happy. Snapshots capture moments in security and retail. Telegraph the semi-public engines driving desire away from prosperity. It's an almost unreachable outpost. But let me tell you, the rubber meets the scree and slides us back into the lobby, a labyrinth of jumbo-weighted regrets, inadmissible in most courts. It's not long before it occurs to us, no angel plays a harp that way. Implacably impatient, maybe we're a little too close to the mic. Like we are way over our heads.
Thank you. Perhaps put up the poem for a second. And the first question I wanted to ask you is, how do angels play the harp? I've often pondered that question. I feel I found someone who can answer
Well,
that.
it's commonly depicted. They're going like this. I mean, it's really, this poem is almost a cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
Paradise is in some ways, it's an object. It's fashioned out of our imaginations. I'm very interested in the ways that people, don't you find it fascinating that one person's paradise is not another person's paradise? And what's paradise for some can be hell for others? And that paradise with the angels has a certain kind of bucolic look. The angels are stroking them. But then you say, well, wait a minute, that's not the way the angels play the harp in my paradise. In fact, that's quite different than my paradise. It's not my paradise at all. So it's to actually to restore paradise, if you will, to something that, again, is fashioned out of our imaginations more than anything else, and that perhaps we have some agency in creating the utopian or paradise. And it's not something that that is ready-made, but rather, or received, but rather something that we might fashion. So you can see it. So snapshots capture moments in security and retail, telegraph the semi-public engines driving desire away from prosperity, an unreachable outpost, right? It's not, paradise is always beyond our reach. But let me tell you, the rubber meets the screen, the rubber hits the road and slides us back into the lobby, a labyrinth of jumbo-weighted regrets, inadmissible in most courts. It's not long before it occurs to us that, no, I really like to slow this down. No angel plays a harp that way, implacably impatient. That is, maybe it's not instant paradise, maybe it's just slower, maybe too close to the mic like we are. way over our heads. So,
Well, great to see
many
that.
ways to read this. Many
Scroll
ways
up
to
to the
read this.
top now, because I'll just ask you, I don't want to do a line by line reading, but
Yeah, sure.
it's really fun to hear you when you, those, that, just let's talk about just the opening couple of lines. We tent ourselves in bittersweet. When I read that, I thought, wow, that's our circumstance. That's sheltering in place. Is it?
Yes, it is. Yes, yes, it is. We tent ourselves in bittersweet. It's also about the kind of, our resignation to our current circumstance as well, right? The bittersweet is the resignation of, I didn't write this during the pandemic. I wrote this obviously some time ago, but it is also about, the disappointment of the 2016 election,
Right.
and some other disappointments which, have seemed to have put a pause on progress, not in the positive sense of a global pause, where blue skies appear over Beijing again because we're not polluting, but a pause which is not so, we don't feel progressive. We don't feel productive. We don't, we feel a little stalled.
And I think go back to Erica, take the poem away so everybody could see her. It's so important not to accept terms like shelter in place. And actually, Governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, made this point yesterday. Shelter in place is a Cold War term where you're in a bunker below. And also, we shouldn't be saying social distancing, but physical distancing, social intimacy, physical distancing. If we keep repeating social distancing, we're falling prey to the very society of the spectacle that we have been fighting against, at least as poets and artists, some of us. So we tent ourselves in bittersweet is such a more powerful way to think about what we're doing. Tents, and they're building a tent in Central Park. I grew up right by that spot. It's very bittersweet to think of the hospital tent. And a friend of mine who lives in Pierre Joris, the great poet, posted a picture of the hospital ship coming under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge by his house. I mean, these are very powerful moments. This poem comes from your most recent collection, Veronica, a suite in 10 parts. And we could just for a second put up the picture of that. You should have that cover. Could you talk a little about the book?
Sure. Veronica took a very long time to write, and it's really a lamentation. It started I started writing it, I think, the day after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And I realized I felt completely implicated in the sense that I'm the mother of two adult Black children, young adults. So this sense of lament that there, was very, very personal. And then I needed to figure out how to get close to that experience. So I guess my unconscious provided that by giving me the name Veronica, which has my name somehow embedded in that. I realized I'm Erica Veronica, and it is about the murders of young Black people with impunity, really going back all the way into the history of this country and lynching and so forth. But I connected it to a lot of those kinds of that's a condition. And so I stayed. It was a very hard book to write because who wants to, I had to figure out how to sit with that grief.
I think we can go just to the picture of Erica now, enough for the cover. I'd like to see her foregrounded, yeah.
Oh, and the cover, by the way, is by Oliver Jackson, the painter, who kindly let me use one of his, Oliver Lee Jackson, it's out of a private collection, and he just had a show at the National Gallery. And it's, it's these huge cutouts, almost Matisse-like, right? But they're not they're not, and you think, oh, are they dancing? But actually he did these cutouts based on using a photograph of the Sharpeville massacre, you know, of the Sharpeville demonstrations in South Africa. So people are being flung back like this. It's about the body, you know, in a kind of, you know, falling back motion. So that's what these cutouts are. So, so it was hard to write it, but it was also good to write. It was, you know, I realized that instead of sort of my kind of, you know, polemicizing, that this was a kind of embodied grief, and I just let myself do it, hard to do. Then finally kind of shift in the book to be a little more formally intentional and smashing certain types of language, because I realized that another part of the book has to do with how there are no words in a way for this, that it had to be, it was you know, how there are no words and yet there have to be words, you know, like both, trying to hold both of those propositions simultaneously.
So let's go on to the other book, which is an extraordinary achievement. I think, as I've told you, it's one of the most important works of poetics to come out in the last decade, but it's a very specific work as well. It's called, and you can put the cover up, but let's just keep the cover up for like 20 seconds, because I think we need to see people, not static images in this conversation. It's called Letters to the Future, Black Women, Radical Writing, and it's edited with Dawn Lundy Martin. So I'll let you talk about it.
Sure. This was a multi-year project, and the cover, by the way, is by Lorna Simpson, and she kindly gave us permission to use you know, images that were available on the gallery. This is on her gallery site, and this was you know, it seemed appropriate. Letters to the Future started out as a workshop that I gave for Cave Canem, a workshop for Black parent poets. And that was really like, well, let's write letters to the future. What would you write about this present moment? And encouraging us to be archaeologists of the present, you know, of this very time. But, and of course, I feel like that's still relevant, because we always write, we make art for a future audience that we, you know, most of the time we won't meet them if we're, you know, right? There are people who will receive them. And what are we communicating or expressing about this time that we're in? I feel like that's really relevant to this moment too, by the way. But Letters to the Future then was to really look at Black women's writing, radical writing, in a broad continuum. And so we not only connect to, I mean, our youngest writer is, you know, in her 30s. The oldest writer in that collection is, I guess she's in her early 80s, but it also includes, so it's, you know, everybody from Adjoa Greaves to Robin Cost Lewis to Lillian Bertram to, we were happy to get something from Adrian Piper, to Adrian Kennedy, who is an email exchange, but we also include, you know, elders who have gone on. So there's a, you know, very rare transcript of conversation between Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez, a rare conversation and transcript of Jane Cortez talking to Tracy Morris. So we, you know, it's a broad anthology. The idea of radical writing is writing that, in which a new sort of purpose and new means to express, and also to express the utopian, or to express this idea of what it is to be free, you know, how that would be rehearsed or how it would be performed in literary art. So, you know, and then of course that means, oh, you mean I don't have to have rules? I don't have to do this, or I can make the rules as I go along? And what would that look like? What would that, you know, you know, so we try to choose work that in some ways would be an execution, or a, you know, an example or a thing that would say, yeah, in this work, I am, you know, I'm using materials to talk about something that is not yet, but will be.
Can you give a context for how this anthology emerges? If we were in person and it was a different time, as you know, I would have asked you if it was on close listening or something like that. I would have done my deadpan. So there are so many books of this kind that are out in the world. Why have you done another one? But I think that the irony of that is hard to express, and I don't even feel that anymore.
There's no other book like
What
this.
I am saying is the opposite. It's within the history of American poetry and poetics, of which I'm obsessed. It's a unique book. Can you explain why I'm saying that?
Yeah, it's a unique book because I don't think that the words Black women's radical writing or Black women's experimental writing is given serious space in, you know, or has been given enough serious space, let's put it that way. And we hoped, I think, to, I know for Dawn in her introduction and certainly for mine, we wanted to talk about not only giving it space, but it just questioning all of those terms. Black women, you know, to really just like say, you don't even know the half of it. You don't even know a quarter of it. Here's some of what's possible within the framework of those terms. So I think what has been really made me, given me pleasure out of this process, besides working with Dawn, who's, you know, was a wonderful partner. We had a lot of fun putting this together, is how people have come up to me and said they're so glad to see this work, how they've used this work, or how it's given, you know, particularly Black women writers, it's given them permission to, you know, to say things, to say their say. One of the plans that we have, and we're, you know, well, you know, we don't know, we have plans right now, but we have plans to, because we're both allergic, both Dawn and I are allergic to anthologies. Is this idea that somehow you can say, enclose in one book something. We're working on a website to continue to solicit work and to make sure that the anthology continues to change and grow. And really, you know, because we couldn't be exhaustive, you know, and of course people come up to us now and we're like, you know, poets like Zandria Phillips and poets who are just out there, and we're just trying to really continue to add to this work so that the anthology is, as I have said elsewhere, a loose leaf binder, not a book with a binding, but something that you change pages and you keep adding to.
So I had many more questions, and maybe there'll be time to get to them, but we're a little bit beyond the midway point in the program, and we want to end with your poem, to give a few minutes for that.
Sure.
So I think that we can take questions from the people here assembled. I see that Charlie has a question, and he could speak on camera for that. I prefer, if we can do it technically, that people who we can see on the monitor speak, to give us a little bit more of a sense of that, rather than to read the question. I don't know if that's a problem, but maybe the people looking at the full grid, which I'm not seeing, could just call upon somebody who raises their hand first. But Charlie, go ahead. Here we also have one from Malvika Jolie, and I'm not even reading it, I just see. So we could go to her second, especially if she has her video up. But Charlie.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Erica, for this really inspiring conversation. Erica, my question is about something you said earlier while you were talking about Veronica. You used the phrase that you were sitting with the grief. And my question was just generally about how grief influences creativity for you.
Yeah, you know, I think some people it does encourage creativity. I'm not sure it did. I mean, it did ultimately, but it took some processing. I'm not, you know, I felt for a long time that I was writing the same poem. You know, that this is really bad. This is really tragic. This is a terrible, you know, I had to figure out how to shift. And maybe that was, you know, I think, what did I say in my note? Fierce grief yeah, fierce wretchedness, does glory bring us? I guess in that sense, that there is some shift, but it does take time, right? And they do, it's almost like you have to sort of be in that sort of, what's that, that sort of push down place, right? And then you sort of figure out what is the way out, but figuring that way out is not always straight ahead. Yeah.
Okay, is Malvika Jolie on camera? Not that we can see. Well, she asks.
Hi.
Oh, good.
Hi,
I definitely want to hear your voice. That's why I don't want to read your question. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Hi. So I was picking up on a theme that was coming up in the comments between Stephanie, who is a nurse, and Riley, who is a PA at the Brooklyn Rail, that I was really loving. There was an idea coming up about the sort of misfit of warfare metaphors for the medical situation, right? And you were also talking about a kind of war metaphor being appropriated. No. Hello?
No, I'm saying yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. And this was really exciting to me because it felt like there's a theme developing also with Charles's idea about the wrongful use of a Soviet term of the bunker, and what you were saying about the language of commerce in this kind of emergency moment, that we're not customers of the apocalypse, we're people. So I feel like there's a question here in the comments about the lexicon of the apocalypse. We're seeing wrongful or unideal usages and metaphors like warfare, capital, the market, kind of Soviet fiction. So my question is what are some alternative lexicons or language systems or metaphors of the apocalypse that you could imagine or suggest? What are other potentially more radical or collectivist metaphors for this particular moment? And then when I guess the way I was thinking about it is I try and work backward from how I might imagine a fictional United States of America that would the speculative government I would want. And then I was wondering, what would the language in the press releases and talk coming from the government that we would what would that language look like?
That's great. That's a great question. And I think that's a wonderful thing for you to write about. I think that it's precisely that kind of attention that I think I want to encourage, because among people, because it's in a way accepting these metaphors puts us in that that state of mind, that frame of mind. Suddenly we're at war. Well, I mean, what's really being talked about is a power struggle, right? We're struggling with something. One of the other phrases I didn't put up is the virus has thrown the human off the throne. We dominate the world, right? We despoil the world, right? They say there's speculation that deforestation has actually led to, more animals, led to the displacement of animals, and led to the virus, jumping over to humankind. So that there's a way that the virus kind of challenges the way that we kind of do what we want with Earth, right? So I think rather than war, as you're pointing out, maybe it is about a certain kind of struggle about how this world will be, and how we learn, or perhaps say, oh, okay, maybe we have to live collaboratively or cooperatively with the world, in a way that that promotes stewardship. I mean, there are some environmental questions here that are really at the heart here, that come right into our face about the environmental disruptions that we provoke, initiate, that are coming to bite us back, right, in these ways. So it's not war per se, but there is something, there's a shift happens. And this is maybe indicative.
Yeah, I see. We have Jeremy. Did you want to say something? Is that what that?
No, it's just clapping because
Clapping, right?
wholeheartedly
Clapping,
just
I'm going to do
visually.
that.
Yep. Thank you.
If somebody does have a question, they could raise their hands because I now have the grid look. But I see that Madeline had a question, and let's go to Madeline. And then Chris, did I see you? My friend Chris Tisch from Detroit. Nice to see you, Chris. I want to call out the people I know in this context, but I'm not going to. But my desire is to do that. Yeah. But Madeline,
you guys.
Yeah.
Okay. This actually relates, I think, really nicely to what we were both just talking about. But I was wondering if you had any advice for poets trying to make sense of their experiences right now. I write poetry, and I've sort of been really wary about ways I might be fetishizing a language of contagion, a language of the virus. There are phrases that are poetically very interesting to me, phrases and images right now. The image of the field hospital, of the hospital ship, even like the phrase community spread or the phrase to flatten the curve. There's all of this really interesting, powerful language, but I'm so wary of using it in a way that is sort of, I guess, at worst fetishizing or at best just uninteresting. So I was wondering if you just have any advice about how to go about making sense of this sort of strange time through poems.
Yeah. So I think, again, poets, because of the particular skills involved in the practice, which is to pay attention and to be also, you know, to use the imagination and care, but it's also about being uncomfortable. You know, so here we are with certain words that might make us uncomfortable and fetishizing, if you will. In a way, what, you know, a poem that sort of says, you know, sort of like goes all in, you know, on contagion and sort of even makes fun of it, hyperbolizes it, you know, just sort of goes all the way, you know, towards it's like its worst form for a moment, reveals it to us. Because it's always there, it's latent. The weirdness of it, the fetishization, it's always there, but we don't pay attention. It doesn't come to surface because it's used in this glib, one-level way in the newspapers or in the press, right? In conventional language. They talk about community spread, and it, you know, you sort of go, well, wait a minute, what's really involved in community spread? What is that? Is that to demonize community? You know, like, is there, like, does that mean that, what does that mean? You know, what, and and also, why is it so homogenizing? Because not all communities are the same, right? Or the words of contagion, right? And that was a Burroughs thing, right? Burroughs used to talk about the, you know, the language virus, right?
Virus, yeah.
Like language virus. And, you know, so to talk about, like, what does it mean to infect somebody with your language or to be infected? And what fears, what projections, what demonizations going on there? And to sort of unpack it. Otherwise, it's latent. It's like, we don't hear it. We don't even hear it. We aren't even sensitive to it. So sometimes being uncomfortable is part of the job, and sort of going into areas of discomfort is part of the job of being an artist, you know? Is to, you know, pause us, to make the person go gasp like that so that they can really see what's there, as opposed to ignoring it and blanketing it down.
So we're going to unmute Chris Tisch. Raise your hand so that they can see you, Chris.
Oh, hi, Chris.
Raising her hand because we're of the invasion of the sound. They have to do that manually.
Yeah.
Are you unblocked now? Is your sound on, Chris? Say hello.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. How are you?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Erica. Hi, Charles. I have a very small technical question. I just got my copy of Erica's Veronica book.
Whoa.
And could you talk about the typographical arrangement on the page, as all the lines are deported to the right margin?
Yeah.
And if there is time, maybe about the compositional strategies behind the whole project. Great to see you, Erica.
Yeah, good to see you too, Chris. Hope you're well and healthy and safe, as for everybody here. But I think the right margin is just to sort of break up our habit, you know, and to give it a certain amount of space, a pause before you breathe to the next line, as space would suggest, like that. But the other thing is, you talked about, so it's really not more than that. The compositional strategy was to simply write linked poems, you know, that they would be different instances around the same, you know, around some of the same kinds of feelings and instances. And also to talk about, I mean, as I said, this poem could have kept going. There were many more sort of iterations or drafts of, you know, lamentation, you know, just grief. And that also is indicative of the ways that the history of lynchings and extrajudicial killings goes forward and back and forward. So so that was one part of the compositional strategy, is to be iterative. And then the second piece was to also pivot somewhere. And so I do pivot, and it gets, you know, I try to remember that even in grief, there is love. So so that more of the sort of latter half of the book has to deal with some way or another with love, you know, so.
Before asking you to read a final poem and finish up the show, I wanted to ask you a more general question about your different aspects of your work. As a professor, teacher now in creative writing at Brown, as an essay writer, something that's a crucial part of your work, and essays are dispersed at this time, but have been very, very influential and often cited, and hopefully will be collected before too long. And of course, as a poet, you've talked more about that, but also, you know, and we were talking about this with Fang Bui just before the show, as the head of a foundation. It's very unusual to have someone who does those other things that you do also be involved in something like a foundation, although it was a very specific kind of foundation. So what I'm asking you, because I'm not asking you to write your autobiography in the next 5 minutes, but I'm interested in the connection between the activities that you are doing. I feel a lot of people I speak to don't see how they can do multiple and contradictory or conflicting things sometimes. And you've lived a life up until now in which that's been, you know, enormously rich. Although I have to say, just because we're here and in public, I do feel that your foundation work did get in the way of your publishing your poetry and essays. And, you know, I mean, there are trade-offs. And I could also say, I guess if we were really on the kind of talk show programs that I'm thinking of, we would ask about your being you know, a parent and a family, but you can add that if you like. But those different aspects of your particular life have been so extraordinary in the way that they've been woven together, but not evenly woven and not completely seamless either. The seams are what's interesting.
Well, I won't say that there are not trade-offs, but I've always been by nature a person who is a lover of, you know, writing and reading, and also at the same time a community person. So, you know, what community work is the dues you pay for living, you know. You know, it's like you have to have some, and I'm a person who likes to have multiple communities. There are all kinds of writers. I try to remind myself, just as there are all kinds of artists. And there are some artists who just who are, you know, feel comfortable and settled and in themselves, truly being themselves, doing one thing. But I've always been a person who likes to do a couple of things. In fact, they feed each other. I don't, you know, some people just write about literature, you know, but I write about literature and, you know, social life. I write poetry that's about social life, about philosophy, about language philosophy, as you know, about all kinds of things. But I would have to be part of those worlds emotionally and intellectually in order to write about them effectively. I can't write from a distance. I'm not that kind of writer. So I think there are all kinds of artists, right? That there's not one kind of artist. And then I also would say that for women, it's a little different. And I say this to women writers that I mentor. Our lives are not that kind of linear, you know, way that men sometimes can live, where they just go and they think on one thing about the next book or their next work. It's not. We're doing a couple, it's like, that's the way we're socialized. And I'm not sure that it isn't a bad way to actually have an actualized life that involves and engages other people seriously and emotionally and intellectually, psychologically. This is the way. And that and that's the way I've looked at it. I'm very interested in the lives of older women artists. So I loved, you know, I loved going to, oh geez. Well, you know, the person I think about, oh God, what happened? What's that woman's name? Choreographer, long life, Margaret, the inventor of modern choreography, woman.
You mean Yvonne Rainer?
No.
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 Martha Graham.
Martha Graham, thank you. Martha Graham. Martha Graham's biopic, which is just so lovely, because she gave up in her 50s and drank for a while and then said, hell, I'll make dance. And she did for another 25 years, from 60 to 85. I feel like that those stories really speak to me about the trajectory of women artists' life. It's not like linear. You do this, you have chapters. You have this chapter, you do this. Then hopefully you shift and you have a second, you have another chapter, and you keep adding those chapters. And that's how we finally look at a life and at a life in art.
Now, I'm going to keep this to the time frame. So I see there are more questions coming in, but we're going to just end with your reading. But before that, with our host, our friend and the person who started this going, Fang Wei. So Fang, you want to say something and speak with Erica for a moment, and then right after that, I won't say a word, just read your poem. And it's been wonderful to spend an hour with you this afternoon. Fang.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Erica, for a very inspiring conversation with Charles here. You talked earlier about so-called potential imagined audience or future reader or viewer. And it just occurred to me, I'm rereading now The Cameron.
Yes.
Was written basically the several tales of group of people who were, you know, quarantined outside of.
That's right. That's right.
And I remember clearly watching Pasolini.
Yes.
Live began with The Cameron and went on to Canterbury Tales and Arabian Nights.
Yes.
It just occurred to me that those three were really a bargain or so-called postponements of death.
Yes. Yes.
Intensify, amplify pleasure, the sense of urgency of pleasure living, because we know it was written in that period during that crisis. You know, 3/4 of Florence population was wiped out by Black Death.
Yes.
That was 1948. So it's interesting about what do we do as poets, as writers, as artists, Erica, who really believe in that notion, that urgency. You know, I know that for sure we once talked about, Charles and I talked about even recently with Candida Alvarez, our recent host also last week, when she recently went to Arezzo to see Piero da Francesca, you know, who was completely irrelevant, neglected. No one ever cared looking at his work until the Impressionists came along and resurrected importance. So these are kind of question I have right now specifically. So I just want to ask you, to your own ideal reader for the future, the imagined audience, what would that look like? just what does that look like, Erica?
Yeah, that's good. That's wonderful. That's really, first of all, you mentioned two of my favorite books, which is the Decameron and 1001 Nights. And I actually have the multi-volume, 16-volume Richard Burton translation of 1001 Nights. It's a crazy thing to own. Anyway, I like that. And in some ways, what all those two books suggest to me is, to quote Lynn, is Heginian, is it's the avoidance of closure. You would hope that people would be able to find a way into that work, and that it wouldn't be a closed world, but a world that somehow suggests, the poem or the artwork somehow suggests that there would be a room for them to co-create it with you or be opened. It would not close things down or close meaning or say, this is the answer right here, must be the, no, but rather a place in which the reader or the perceiver is invited to continue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Instigation. Thank you for that question. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gave me some ideas.
So let's end with a poem, Erica.
Okay. The future, the back of the future. The future is back. So where do I begin? The future is back and it is ungovernable. It's back and it sucks, just as I've been told. It's all in the hands. The future is back and it's been frozen in place, a germ waiting to thaw. The future's back and X marks the spot where it was last seen, picking cotton, cutting cane. The future's back and can't remember what it came into the room for. The future's back, having locked the keys in the car. The future's back, no gimmick, I promise. You're the prize, you. The future's back and swim is what we do next. The future's back, it's a dance craze. The future's back and they've loaded the clocks with slugs. The future's back and the light is imperfect. The future's back, crawl into this. The future's back and I don't see our names. False. The future's back in a disjointed Q&A. The future's back, first time farce, second time tragedy, third time ecological collapse. The future's back if you go back far enough. The future's back, take it from here. The future's back, time's on strike. The future's back, under an assumed name. The future's back, what have you done for me lately? The future's back, we read the instructions this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Great to have you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thanks for sharing some poetry on a Monday. It's a good way to start the week.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.